There's a line inside every empath that almost nobody, including the empath herself, knows exists until the exact moment it finally gets crossed. Not the line people assume, the one drawn after the first betrayal, the first cruel word, the first moment someone shows their true colors. Empaths cross past that line constantly, almost as a defining feature of who they are. They forgive what shouldn't be forgiven. They stay through what should have ended things immediately. They extend a kind of grace so vast it looks, to outside observers, almost like it has no bottom at all. But it does have a bottom. And what happens the moment an empath finally reaches it? The moment she's pushed so far past every previous limit that something inside her simply refuses to bend any further, is one of the most misunderstood psychological events in any relationship, precisely because almost nobody, including the people who caused it, ever sees it coming. Today, we're going to walk through exactly what happens when an empath is pushed too far. Not the dramatic movie version most people imagine, the screaming confrontation, the explosive final argument, the door slammed so hard the walls shake. What actually happens is far quieter, far more permanent, and far more devastating to the person who finally caused it than any explosive scene could ever be. Let's start with understanding why empaths tolerate so much more than most people before reaching this point in the first place, because this context is essential to understanding what actually happens once the limit is finally reached. An empath's capacity for tolerance isn't simply a personality quirk or a character flaw, as it's so often framed by people frustrated with how long she stays, how much she forgives, how many chances she extends to people who've clearly demonstrated they don't deserve them. Her tolerance is built on something much deeper, a genuine belief in human complexity, in the possibility of growth, in the idea that behavior, however hurtful, often stems from pain rather than pure malice, and that pain, given enough compassion and patience, can eventually heal into something better. This belief isn't naive, even though it's frequently mistaken for naivety by people who don't share her depth of understanding about human psychology. It's actually a sophisticated, nuanced worldview, one that recognizes the difference between a person's worst behavior and their full humanity, one that refuses to reduce another human being to a single cruel action, no matter how much that action hurt. This is precisely why an empath's tolerance extends so much further than most people's. She's not simply being weak or lacking self-respect or failing to recognize red flags the way outside observers often assume. She's operating according to a genuinely held belief system that people deserve grace, that context matters, that judgment should be reserved until every possible explanation has been considered and exhausted. For a long time, this belief system serves her well, allowing her to build deep, meaningful relationships with people who genuinely deserve the patience she extends them, who meet her grace with growth, who honor the compassion she offers by actually becoming better because of it. This is the beautiful version of what her tolerance makes possible, and it's precisely why she doesn't abandon this approach even when it starts costing her more than it should. But when this same tolerance meets someone incapable of the growth she keeps extending grace toward, someone who interprets her patience not as an invitation to become better, but as evidence that there will never be real consequences for continued cruelty, something begins accumulating that she herself often doesn't fully recognize until it's already reached a critical mass. This accumulation is the key to understanding what actually happens when an empath is finally pushed too far, because unlike people whose limits get triggered by a single dramatic event, an empath's limit is almost always the result of cumulative erosion, hundreds, sometimes thousands of small moments where her grace was met with continued harm, where her forgiveness produced no actual change, where her belief in someone's capacity for growth kept getting quietly, painfully disappointed over and over, in ways too small individually to justify leaving, but too consistent collectively to ignore forever. This is why the moment an empath finally reaches her limit so often looks, from the outside, disproportionate to whatever specific incident seemed to trigger it. Family members, friends, sometimes even the narcissist himself will point to the final incident and say with genuine confusion, "That's what finally did it?" After everything else she tolerated, this relatively minor thing was somehow the final straw. But this confusion misunderstands entirely how the accumulation actually works. The final incident was never really about its own individual severity. It was simply the moment when the cumulative weight of everything that came before it finally exceeded what her capacity for tolerance could continue absorbing, regardless of how minor or major that specific final incident happened to be in isolation. And here's what makes this moment so different from anything that came before it in the relationship, so fundamentally unlike every previous conflict, every previous disappointment, every previous moment where she seemed close to leaving but somehow found the strength or the hope or the exhaustion to stay anyway. This time, something inside her doesn't bend, it breaks. And what happens after that break is unlike anything the narcissist has ever witnessed from her before, precisely because he spent the entire relationship studying and relying on a version of her that this particular break renders. Here's what makes this specific kind of break so different from every previous conflict, every previous threat to leave, every previous moment of anger that eventually resolved back into the familiar pattern of forgiveness and continuation. In every prior instance, some part of her remained tethered to hope. Hope that this time might be different. Hope that the pain she was expressing might finally produce genuine change. Hope that staying and fighting for the relationship was still worth the cost it kept extracting from her. When an empath is truly pushed too far, that tether doesn't just weaken. It severs completely, and it severs in a way that cannot be reattached through any of the tactics that worked so reliably before. This is the first thing that actually happens when an empath reaches this point, and it's almost invisible from the outside because it happens entirely internally, often without any dramatic external signal that anything fundamental has changed. She doesn't announce that something has shifted. She doesn't necessarily even fully understand it herself in the initial moment it occurs. But something in her nervous system, her psychology, her fundamental orientation toward this specific relationship simply reorganizes itself around a new understanding that cannot be undone. This person is not capable of the change she spent years hoping for, and continuing to hope for it is no longer something she's willing or even able to keep doing. The second thing that happens, often following closely behind this internal severing, is something that confuses and destabilizes the narcissist more than almost anything else he's ever encountered in the relationship. Her emotional reactivity toward him begins to disappear rapidly and almost completely. This is crucial to understand because it represents such a stark departure from the pattern he's relied on for the entire duration of the relationship. Throughout their time together, he's learned to read her emotional reactions as a kind of ongoing feedback mechanism, using her hurt, her anger, her tears, her desperate attempts to understand and fix whatever's going wrong between them, as confirmation that he still holds significant influence over her internal world. Her emotional reactivity, however painful for her to experience, has always functioned as proof of his continued relevance, his continued power, his continued ability to affect her deeply, regardless of how badly he treats her. When she's finally pushed past her limit, this reactivity doesn't just decrease, it often vanishes almost entirely, replaced by something that looks disturbingly like calm indifference. This isn't because she's stopped feeling things. The depth of feeling that defines her as an empath doesn't simply disappear because she's reached her limit with one particular person. It's because her nervous system has finally, permanently reclassified him as someone whose behavior no longer warrants the emotional investment she's been offering for so long. This shift terrifies narcissists in a way that few other developments in a relationship ever do, because it represents the loss of the exact mechanism they've always relied on to maintain control. Anger, even rage, still offers something to work with, evidence that she still cares enough to be hurt, still invested enough to fight, still tethered enough to the relationship that eventual reconciliation remains possible if he just applies the right combination of tactics. But calm indifference offers nothing. There's no emotional thread left to pull, no vulnerability left to exploit, no lever remaining that once reliably produced the reaction he needed to feel back in control. The third thing that happens, often the most permanently transformative of all, is that an empath who has been pushed this far stops extending explanations for her behavior. This might sound like a small shift, but it represents one of the most profound changes in the entire dynamic, because for the entire duration of the relationship prior to this point, she's operated according to an unconscious belief that if she just explains herself clearly enough, thoroughly enough, patiently enough, eventually he'll understand, eventually he'll change, eventually the explanation itself will produce the outcome she's been hoping for. Once she's truly reached her limit, this belief simply dissolves, not through some dramatic realization she consciously articulates, but through the accumulated weight of watching explanation after explanation fail to produce any actual change, until finally something in her simply stops trying. She stops justifying her boundaries. She stops explaining why she's upset. She stops offering the detailed accounts of her feelings that she used to believe were necessary for him to finally understand the impact of his behavior. This absence of explanation is often mistaken by the narcissist and sometimes even by outside observers for coldness or cruelty. But what's actually happening is something closer to a fundamental recalibration of where she believes her energy should be directed. She's finally stopped believing that her explanations have the power to produce change in someone who has already demonstrated, repeatedly, that understanding was never actually the obstacle preventing him from treating her better in the first place. And this is where something crucial begins to emerge, something that goes beyond simply describing what happens internally when an empath is pushed too far, into territory that reveals exactly what this transformation ultimately means for everything that follows, both for the relationship itself and for the woman who has just crossed a threshold she can never fully return from. Because once these three shifts have fully taken hold, the severed hope, the vanished reactivity, the absence of explanation, something happens that the narcissist almost never anticipates, precisely because nothing in his entire history with her prepared him for the possibility that this particular ending might actually be final. He tries the old tactics first because they've always worked before. He escalates the charm, certain that enough effort will eventually reignite the reactivity he's grown so dependent on. He manufactures crises, hoping her caretaking instincts will override whatever's shifted inside her. He apologizes, sometimes more elaborately than he ever has before, using language he's learned over years together tends to move her most effectively, and for the first time in the entire relationship, none of it works. This is the moment that reveals with brutal clarity exactly what was happening underneath all of her previous tolerance. Because if her patience had simply been weakness, if her endless forgiveness had simply been an inability to protect herself, these tactics would likely still work, at least partially, the way they always had before. But what's actually revealed, once none of it moves her anymore, is that her tolerance was never weakness at all. It was a conscious, if painful, choice, one she was fully capable of unmaking the moment she finally decided the cost had become too high to keep paying. This realization is often devastating for the narcissist in a way that goes beyond simply losing access to a source of supply, because it forces a confrontation, however brief, however quickly rationalized away through blame or denial, with the reality that she was never actually incapable of leaving. She was choosing to stay, for reasons that made sense to her at the time, and now she's choosing something different, with the same clarity and capability she's always actually possessed underneath the appearance of endless, boundless tolerance. What happens next, for the empath herself, is perhaps the most important part of this entire transformation, because it extends far beyond the end of this specific relationship into something that reshapes her entire future. Because once someone has been pushed this far, once they've discovered this particular threshold exists within them and crossed it permanently, something remarkable happens to how they approach every future relationship, every future boundary, every future moment where someone might test the limits of what they're willing to tolerate. She no longer needs to be pushed nearly as far the next time. This is one of the most powerful, though rarely discussed, consequences of having survived being pushed too far once, because now she carries direct, embodied knowledge of what her limit actually feels like, what the process of reaching it costs her, and crucially, what life looks like on the other side of finally honoring it. This knowledge changes her relationship with future red flags entirely. She no longer needs years of cumulative erosion before recognizing when something has crossed a line that matters, because she's already lived through what happens when that recognition gets delayed for too long. This is why so many empaths who've survived this particular threshold report feeling, paradoxically, more protected rather than more damaged by the experience, once enough time has passed to fully integrate what happened. Not because the pain of reaching that limit wasn't real, wasn't devastating, wasn't something they would have avoided if given any real choice in the matter, but because surviving it taught them something no amount of theoretical self-help advice could have taught them in advance, exactly where their own line actually exists, exactly what it costs to keep crossing past it, and exactly what becomes possible once they finally, permanently refuse to keep doing so. This is what really happens when an empath is pushed too far. Not an explosion, though there might be moments of genuine anger along the way. Not a dramatic, cinematic confrontation, though the internal experience is every bit as significant as any dramatic scene could ever convey. What actually happens is quieter, more permanent, and ultimately more powerful than any explosive ending could ever be. A woman who has spent years extending grace, finally discovering, through the most painful means possible, that her capacity for grace was never actually the problem. The problem was always believing that grace, extended indefinitely, was the price required to be considered a genuinely good person. Once she's pushed far enough to finally unlearn that belief, she doesn't just leave one relationship behind, she leaves behind an entire way of measuring her own worth through how much she's willing to endure. And what she carries forward instead, calm, clear, finally free from the exhausting burden of endless tolerance, is something no one, not the narcissist who pushed her there, not anyone who comes after him, will ever again be able to take from her. Her limit. Finally, fully, permanently her own, permanently, irreversibly obsolete.